I'd like to get your perspective on what is the modern state of Israel, the 1948 state of Israel? What is it to you?
So for me, I belong to a community that's rather, although somewhat, I'm not maybe a card-carrying member, but I do send my children to their schools, and there is a community that I would say probably could have as many as 250,000 adherents in the broadest sense of these various communities that are in somewhat communion with each other. Um, that believes that the state of Israel is, and the Zionist movement in all forms, whether in the religious form or certainly in the secular form, is a total aberration and goes against uh, both from the biblical perspective and from a Talmudic perspective and from the perspective of the consensus of rabbinic opinions through the centuries, violates many basic concepts of Judaism, and also has issues on an eschatological sense that actually would, if you would translate into a Christian parlance, could, even though we disagree on who the Messiah is, who the Christ is, or would be, or whatever that is, could probably rightly be called antichrist in that sense that it's anti-Messiah. It's standing in the way of really the realization of eschatology, where all the prophets prophesied of world peace, whether the Christian perspective that would be a second coming, and the traditional Jewish perspective would be a first coming. Obviously, there's other issues as the identity of the soul of the Messiah and so forth. That's obvious differences between Christianity and Judaism, but nonetheless, we have statements in the Talmud that tell us, based on the book of Song of Solomon, Canticles, where King Solomon says several times, speaking in the name of God, as it's understood as a parable between God's love to his people. And again, of course, Christians understand that between Christ and the church, and the Jewish understanding is between God and the nation of Israel, in the sense of the religious community, not in any nationalistic sense. It says, "I make you swear, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the deer and the antelope of the field, if you arouse or awaken my love before I desire." Um, and that way that the Talmud understands that is that, and since it's mentioned several times, that represents various oaths. When it's saying, I'm making you swear to these oaths, not to arouse my love before I desire. In the same sense, a husband and wife have to respect each other, including in the most intimate sense of the respect for one another, and cannot force themselves on one another, that to go ahead and to set up artificially through political or military means to set up a Jewish state is a violation of that oath. And it's, throughout the Bible and in our liturgy, it's clear that the Jewish people are exiled from the Holy Land because of our sins, and that the cure to that is not to go get an army and go take over the Holy Land. The cure to that is repentance and turning back to God.
Which
But in
has been
addition to that,
which has been the
say that
message
again.
from day one. So the Christians would say that this was the problem at the beginning, and that when the Messiah arrived, the Jews of the day wanted to pick up swords and defeat the Roman Empire, reclaim Jerusalem, and God was saying, that's not what I'm about. This is not the message. And it seems that we're at the same place. There are two tracks I'd like to take this, but I mean, I didn't know where this conversation was going to go. But one of them, from hearing what you've just been saying, is that the eschatological background. So it seems to me, so Christians are split on this, particularly in America. There's this modern heresy of dispensationalism, which wouldn't actually agree with me on what you were just saying about the Songs of Solomon. In that, so most Christians throughout all of history would say that yes, the church is now the spiritual Israel. The people of God is now, the Jews and the Gentiles grafted together to become the church, not a replacement, but a grafting together. And so the promise is to them. But the new heresy of dispensationalism, those Christians would still say that the Jews are the chosen people of God. And so I don't know what Christians are in that perspective. But to the dispensationalists, who are very supportive of Israel to the point of calling themselves Christian Zionists, which, again, to me is strange to be a Christian Jewish nationalist, would say that they want the red heifers, they want the temple rebuilt, they want all of these things because what they're trying to do is force God's hand, right? So they're trying to force God's hand for the end times, these evangelical Christians. And so they are promoting and supporting all of this. But my concern would be that we know that the Jewish people are still waiting. Well, the Jewish people who rejected Christ are still waiting for their Messiah, right? And so the Jewish people are waiting for a Messiah. Christians aren't waiting for a Messiah, but we are expecting an Antichrist who would paint himself as a Messiah and try to give the perspective of world peace, as you alluded to. And so I find it odd that evangelical Christians are helping non-Christian Jews, non-Messianic Jews, in seeking their Messiah, who could very well be the Christian Antichrist. It seems very, very odd to me. Does that make sense in your worldview as well?
I've actually confronted evangelical Christians on this question, and they've pretty much, again, since you come from a church where you have apostolic succession, you have authorities that you go to. You don't have sola scriptura. Most of the rest of the Protestant world has sola scriptura, even though dispensationalism came from Anglicans who originally began at Darby, others,
Yeah.
but it was popularized by Schofield and others, and in America became very popular. Obviously, that wasn't the belief of the church for 2,000 years until that point. It's a novelty. But I remember confronting someone. It was someone. It was a radio program of Dr. Brown. He was absent that day. He calls himself a Messianic Jew. I would say he's just a Christian because his theology, I do recognize there are possibility of Messianic Jews who believe Jesus is Messiah, who maintain their Judaism. I don't believe Michael Brown does that, but it was a guest host who I don't remember who it was, and he pretty much confirmed that this was basically pushing toward that Antichrist. From his perspective as an evangelical Christian, that it wasn't the matter of, well, we think the Jews are right, that Jesus is not the Messiah, but we're going to jumpstart this process that's going to bring around the Antichrist. That's basically how this particular person on the radio, I don't remember who it was, this was a number of years ago, basically expressed himself without, as a lot of the missionaries who espouse what they call Messianic Judaism would say, they often will use different language to try to attract Jewish people, which goes back, into history. And so he said something along the lines that there would be an anti-Messiah that would come and set up and all these things, and that was just part of the eschatology that would unfold. But nonetheless, you are awaiting the second coming of Christ,
Right.
Which is the fulfillment of all of the,
which is the end times, is the judgment day.
Yeah, but all of the biblical Old Testament, what Christians call Old Testament scriptures, that both Jews and Christians would agree to be about the Messiah, Christians say those will be with the second coming.
Right.
So it's a different, so that one of my teachers, when he was confronted by this is Rabbi Bart Sadok, who's on television often, and he said he was confronted by Hal Lindsey, very famous eschatologically minded evangelical, tried to convert him, and he said, I don't care when the time comes if it's the first coming or the second coming. All I care is that we can both go together and say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that was, that's kind of, my approach is, until it happens, it happens. And that's, I have not found anything that, and I've studied all these different religions. I find the Jewish apologetics to be, to me, the most convincing, but I respect other religions and understand that other people, just as a matter of being realistic and being pragmatic and living in a world, and I think, and someone can have very strongly held beliefs as you do, without hating other people and without saying, you can say this other person, you can say I'm 100% wrong without hating me.
Yeah.
And I can say, in my perspective, you're wrong without hating you. And that's really, I think, the
That's
big
how it used
message.
to
And
be
I think,
anyway.
yeah, but I mean, you can hate the perspective. You can, like they say, hate hate the sin, but
Not the
love the
sinner.
sinner type of idea, which is not a biblical idea unless how we homiletically understand the end of Psalm 104. But in any event, that's
Well, it comes from hating what is evil, but loving thy neighbor.
yeah,
And
yeah, and the Psalm says, those who love the Lord hate evil.
yeah. So I mean, again, there are so many tracks I could take this, and I wish we had all day. But
We
so,
could
as
talk.
an
We could talk
Orthodox,
another time too.
as an Orthodox Jew, was tracking back to Israel because I've spent some time in Israel, right? And I've spoken to liberal Jews who are just, yeah, and I've spoken to conservative Jews who I completely understand. The idea of Zionism being Jewish nationalism and wanting to protect that Jewish idea of a nation. I completely get that. As a Christian nationalist, that's what I want, a Christian nation that is observant of our faith and gives us the liberties to worship within those bounds. However, while I was over there, I noticed that there's a demographic of people that live in Israel but don't necessarily engage with Israel. And that's the demographic that I didn't get to spend time with. So I spent time with the liberal Jews, the conservative Jews, but not the Orthodox Jews. And so if you could shed a bit of light on this, so because it seems that you're not recognizing Israel, 1948 Israel as a biblical Israel, which you and I would agree on, but there are people from your tradition or similar traditions that live there, but don't necessarily engage with it in that way. How does that work?
And that would be more or less the community that I would identify with ideologically. To be fair, the term Orthodox refers to doctrine. We have 13 basic dogmas of Judaism. So the religious Zionists, for the most part, would be Orthodox.
Right.
So so probably a lot of the more conservative religious nationalists that you encountered would also be Orthodox.
Right. But not
And
Hasidic.
but Hasidic is a different perspective. That's you have among the ultra Orthodox and even among the modern Orthodox different more cultural and theological differences. We can all get together if we agree on orthodoxy. We'll pray in each other's synagogues. Our liturgy might be slightly different, but the ultra Orthodox world, which includes both the Hasidic and non-Hasidic branches, can also again be politically divided between the non-Zionists and the anti-Zionists. So in Israel, in America, that doesn't, or throughout the diaspora, that doesn't really translate as differently as much. But in Israel, it's much more marked because of the ideas. So you would see the modern Orthodox will emphatically serve in the IDF and see it as a religious obligation. The non-Orthodox generally will seek exemptions from the IDF under the same ideas that in America, if you were in a religious seminary, you were exempt from the draft when we had a draft.
Yeah.
And then, but they will vote in the Israeli elections. They'll have representatives in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, and accept welfare from the Israeli government. And then you have the anti-Zionist communities, which pretty much don't see themselves as Israeli citizens. When the UN was deciding whether to create the state of Israel in 1947, finally, declared it in 1948. The chief rabbi of the anti-Zionist community in Jerusalem was Rabbi Dushinsky, and he came to America, to Lake Success, New York, where the UN was meeting at the time. It's on the border of Queens and Nassau County near Great Neck, Long Island, actually right where I was born, and grew up much of my life as a child. And so Rabbi Dushinsky came and begged the UN that the ultra-Orthodox community of Jerusalem, mostly in Mea She'arim, which is the 100 Gates community. It's a quote from Genesis that Isaac was blessed with 100 gates. And that community is mostly from this mindset of the anti-Zionist mindset. And basically, and their community would be called the Eda Haredit. The Eda Haredit is the community of the ultra-Orthodox, or Haredi really means those who tremble, kind of like the Quakers, you see, Orthodox Jews often, quake and tremble in liturgical prayer. Some do and some don't. But the point was that he was asking that they should not become ipso facto Israeli citizens just by virtue of being Jews in the Holy Land at the time when the state of Israel was announced. When it was under Ottoman rule, the Jewish community accepted the dimitude. Understood they paid the jizya tax. They understood that they are second-class citizens as far as the political realm, living under Islam, but they lived their own lives and they were afforded protection and so forth because they understood that in the who they were. And the same thing, Jewish communities under Christendom did the same thing. I was reading about my ancestors came from Hungary and before that in Germany, and one of my ancestors was a chief rabbi in Worms in Germany, and they described when the lay leaders in the synagogue were appointed, they had to be approved by the Christian bishop. Of course, that was around the Reformation time, so it changed from Catholic to Lutheran and so forth in that area. That was just around where everything was happening. And so I'm not sure exactly where that fit in. And I don't know if the Jewish community really was even following everything that politically and theologically was happening at that time. But the rule was that the bishop had to approve the president of the synagogue, the treasurer of the synagogue, and had to be sworn in. It said someone who was learned, I believe, probably was a deacon or someone, and he had a certain book that he had to read from to swear in. And I think the Jewish lay leaders actually had to go to the cathedral to be sworn in as lay leaders in the Jewish community. It was understood that we're an exiled people, and we are subservient to whatever dominant culture we're living under. So if we're living under Christians, we have to submit to the Christian rule while maintaining our faith, maintaining our religion as a distinct community. And the same thing living under Islamic rule. When Jews moved to India and China, where it was a little bit, there wasn't that same dominant structure, they often got assimilated and lost, and those communities never really grew the way that Jewish communities actually grew very strongly under Christendom and under Islam. So it was, and that was the world that we lived in until, after the Reformation, we came to the Enlightenment, the United States, and so forth. And so we had new challenges of how, and many Jews abandoned their faith, but didn't convert to the other religions. Generally, before that, if you left the Jewish community in a Christian country, you became a Christian. Right. If you left the Jewish community in an Islamic country, you became a Muslim. Now you have this whole society where you don't have to be an Orthodox Jew to be Jewish and to have this identity. Whereas from our perspective, we say, well, all that means is a person born of a Jewish mother or a person who converted to Judaism under our liturgical and ecclesiastical rules has different obligations than a non-Jewish person has. Yeah. And so if a person doesn't believe in that, so they have no right to represent us as a community. Right. If someone apostatizes to another religion, it was understood they were no longer part of the Jewish community. But if they apostatize and say, well, now I'm a secular Jew, or now I'm a liberal Jew, but I deny the basic dogmas of the faith, and I don't practice the most basic required practices to identify with the community. It was, Maimonides already said, someone who openly violates the Sabbath loses his status in the Jewish community. He's no longer Jewish. He doesn't count liturgically to a quorum. If he touches wine, the wine is no longer permitted, and so forth. It's not a racial issue. It's an issue of belief, and an issue of practice, and an issue of devotion to God. So, and that was what the Jewish identity always was until that time.
That's fascinating.
And so then,
just to
so then the
on
Orthodox world had to
Well, it
figure
sounds like
that
you're saying
out.
that liberal Jews and secular Jews are not actually Jews, and that makes a lot of sense to me if you see Judaism as a religion. But it has been twisted into an ethnicity in recent years. And of course, there are genealogical elements to it. Of course, there are because it's a group that has been, you know. But are you saying that Judaism should remain a religion, and that's clearer? Is that where you're coming from?
That's my thesis, is that Judaism is only a religion, and those people, I would call them non-Gentiles,
Hmm.
meaning there's nothing wrong in Judaism to be a Gentile.
Okay.
According to the Jewish religion, there's no requirement for someone who is not born Jewish to convert to Judaism. Once someone does that, it's the same. The Bible says Israel is a kingdom of priests in Exodus 19:6. And the way I often compare it to is that in Christian traditions, when someone becomes a priest, he's accepting certain rules. There's no requirement in Christianity to become a priest.
Right.
But once you do so, in whatever version of traditional Christianity, you're accepting certain things upon yourself that now as a priest you're required to do. In Catholicism, that includes celibacy. And your Anglican tradition or Orthodox tradition, it includes other obligations
Well, let
that
me give
a
you
priest has
let me give you
that
another
a lay person doesn't.
let me give you an expansion on that. So we would use similar language in the kingdom of priests. So any Christian, anyone that's baptized, is through that baptism a priest in the royal priesthood of all believers. So every Christian has certain obligations, such as go forth, multiply, disciple the nations, to spread the good news of the gospel. So yeah, in the same way you were saying, all Jewish people should be observant and have obligations. All Christian people likewise should be priests to some degree, not sacerdotal priests, of course, so not celebrating the sacraments, but all the other stuff. Yes, absolutely, I agree with you.
Thank you for watching my Common Sense Crusade. If you'd like to watch the whole show, you can subscribe to lotuseaters.com for as little as £5 per month, and then you get access to a bank of content as well. My show is 3 p.m. every Thursday. See you there. Deus Vult.